You're with us for a deep dive today. We're looking into something pretty significant, often talked about, the relationship between the United States and Israel, specifically the support the U.S. provides.
That's right. And we've been looking at a discussion featuring Noam Chomsky on this very topic.
Exactly. So our goal here is to unpack the reasons he lays out, the core arguments he makes for this, well, this consistent alignment.
Yeah, we want to get beyond just the surface level.
Yeah.
Look at the historical stuff, the cultural angles, the strategy he talks about.
Okay, let's jump right in then. One of the first things Chomsky brings up, and I found this pretty, well, surprising actually, is the influence of Christian Zionism.
And specifically that its roots go back even further than Jewish Zionism.
Right, which is not what you might immediately think.
No. And he points to its momentum, especially in England. Chomsky argues it was a major factor behind the Balfour Declaration.
And therefore, British support for Jewish settlement in Palestine.
Exactly. And it wasn't just politics, according to this analysis. There were strong religious interpretations at play within, the British elite.
So like a theological motivation.
Yeah, kind of. The idea, apparently quite influential, was that the return of Jews to Palestine was a necessary step before the Second Coming. So a powerful religious driver for supporting it.
And he stresses this wasn't just a British thing, right? This religious viewpoint was quite embedded in the elite culture over there and in the U.S. too.
Definitely. He gives examples, Woodrow Wilson reading the Bible every day, Harry Truman's strong personal faith.
Suggests it's sort of a baseline belief influencing how they saw the world, maybe policy too.
It seems so. And Chomsky mentions this quote from Harold Ikes, prominent in Roosevelt's administration.
What did he say?
He apparently called the return of Jews to Palestine the greatest event in history.
Wow.
Yeah. And the interpretation was that this was, biblical prophecy being fulfilled. It really shows the religious lens some powerful people were using.
And Chomsky connects us all back to colonialism, doesn't he?
He does. He links it to what he calls the Anglosphere, places like the U.S., Australia, Canada.
Okay, what's the connection there?
He frames them as, unusual types of imperial projects. Settler societies basically focused on displacing the indigenous people already there.
Right.
And he suggests that sometimes principles like Christian Zionism were part of the motivation behind that displacement. It's quite a framework he puts forward.
So when he says Anglosphere here, it's specifically about that settler colonial model, not just countries speaking English.
Yeah, exactly. That shared history of European settlement leading to displacement. And the argument is that within these branches of England, as he puts it, the drive wasn't always purely economic or political. Sometimes a religious element, like Christian Zionism, was also shaping things.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on just with the historical roots. Let's shift focus a bit. Chomsky then talks about the strategic side, the geopolitics, especially around 48 when Israel was established.
Right. And he points out there wasn't, immediate universal agreement within the U.S. government itself.
Oh, like what?
Well, he contrasts the State Department's view with the Pentagon's. The State Department apparently had some initial reservations.
About the creation of Israel.
Yeah, concerns about the refugee situation, the displacement, and the need for some kind of practical solution for those people.
Okay, so State was cautious, but the Pentagon?
They had a different take, according to Chomsky. They were quite taken with Israel's military prowess, even early on.
Impressed by their strength.
Pretty much. He mentions declassified reports from former chiefs of staff.
And what did those say?
Described Israel as the second strongest military in the region, after Turkey, and even floated the idea of Israel as a potential base for U.S. forces.
Interesting. So that admiration for military capability was a factor early on.
Seems like it. It laid some groundwork for the relationship evolving.
He also flags the 1958 regional crisis as important.
Yes, because Israel was apparently the only country that really firmly sided with Britain and the U.S. during that upheaval.
And that led to more tangible support.
A big increase, yeah. More government backing, more military aid. So you see a strategic alignment really starting to solidify there.
It's like the U.S. began seeing Israel as a reliable partner in a pretty volatile region.
A partner whose military strength could be useful for Western interests, yeah. So you see that shift from maybe some initial hesitation to a more concrete strategic pact developing.
Okay, and then we get to 1967. Chomsky really emphasizes this year, doesn't he?
Absolutely. He presents it as the watershed moment, the point where the U.S.-Israeli relationship became what it is today, essentially.
And his argument is that Israel performed a major service for the U.S.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
By decisively defeating secular Arab nationalism.
Which the U.S. saw as its main adversary in the region at the time.
Exactly, that's the analysis.
Why was secular Arab nationalism seen as such a threat?
Well, you have to remember the Cold War context. The U.S. was very concerned about Soviet influence spreading in the Middle East.
Right.
These secular nationalist movements, often led by figures like Nasser in Egypt, were seen as potentially leaning towards the Soviets, or at least challenging U.S. dominance and, critically, access to oil.
So, by defeating them militarily in '67,
Israel, in Chomsky's view, basically removed a huge obstacle to U.S. influence in the region. It's a strong claim.
it is. And he also points out what seems like a contradiction, doesn't he? The U.S. support, sometimes, for radical Islam.
Yes, that's another layer. How the U.S. opposed secular nationalism, but at various points supported certain Islamist groups historically and even now. It complicates the picture.
He then uses Gaza as a very current example of the ongoing support.
Right, the Gaza example is striking because it's so recent and direct.
What specifically does he highlight?
That during the last big conflict there, Israel, despite having a massive arsenal itself, apparently started running low on some types of ammunition.
Okay.
And the U.S. Pentagon stepped in, quickly resupplying them.
And wasn't there something specific about where that ammunition came from?
Yes, that's key. It was apparently from U.S. stockpiles already positioned in Israel, stuff intended for use by American forces if needed.
Wow. That speaks volumes about the level of integration, doesn't it?
It really does. Chomsky sees this as basically treating Israel like a forward base, almost a, quote, soldier for America in the region.
And he mentions intelligence sharing, too.
Briefly, yeah. Just notes the deep, long-standing intelligence ties and other connections, all reinforcing that idea of a very close strategic partnership where Israel helps advance U.S. goals.
Okay, so we've gone through the history, the strategy. Chomsky then turns to the media and how narratives get shaped in the U.S.
Yeah, this is about public perception and how it's formed. He argues there's a strong tendency in the media to essentially back up government policy. Not much fundamental questioning.
Can you give an example he uses?
The U.S. invasion of Iraq is a big one. He points out how the phrase American occupation of Iraq was, well, almost totally absent from the mainstream U.S. media.
Even though it clearly was an occupation.
By standard definitions, yes. And he notes that under the Nuremberg principles, aggressive war leading to occupation is considered a major international crime.
Right.
But the language used didn't reflect that gravity.
That's stark. He contrasts it with how Obama later criticized the war.
Right. Obama called it a strategic blunder. Chomsky draws a parallel, saying it's like a German general criticizing Hitler's invasion of Russia purely as a strategic mistake, rather than condemning the invasion itself.
It misses the fundamental issue, basically.
That's the implication. He gives another example, too, Vietnam.
What about Vietnam?
The phrase American invasion of South Vietnam. He says you basically wouldn't find that in mainstream U.S. media going back to 1961 unless you looked at, marginal dissident outlets.
There's a pattern of language use that avoids certain framing.
Exactly. And he contrasts this, interestingly, with what's happening now in Britain. He mentions serious discussions happening in places like the Times Literary Supplement about whether Britain needs to confront its colonial past, even using terms like genocide to describe aspects of it from centuries ago.
Suggesting maybe a different level of national self-reflection or willingness to use harsher terms for past actions?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
It highlights a potential difference in how historical events are discussed and framed publicly.
And Chomsky connects this meaty tendency to a broader point about intellectuals, right?
He does. He suggests that often intellectuals tend to align with state power rather than being the independent critics they might see themselves as.
Which goes against the common image of the intellectual as a dissenter.
Right. He uses this phrase, a herd of independent minds. The idea is that many thinkers, while believing they're independent, actually end up clustering around and reinforcing the state's narrative.
And he says this isn't new.
No, he concludes it's a long-standing tendency. It's a pretty sobering thought about the role intellectuals play in society and relation to power.
Okay, so bringing this all together then, we've really explored quite a few layers here based on Chomsky's perspective on U.S. support for Israel.
We really have. Started with that maybe surprising role of Christian Zionism way back.
Then traced how the strategic relationship developed, hesitations early on, but then really solidifying, especially after 67.
Right, with that argument about defeating Arab nationalism being a key service to the U.S.
And finally, looking at how media narratives, according to this view, tend to reinforce the status quo and limit fundamental debate.
Exactly. It's presented as this mix of factors: religious belief in some circles, hard-nosed strategic calculation, and the power of accepted narratives all coming together to shape this really enduring and often debated relationship.
It certainly gives you a different lens. Which leads to a final thought, maybe, for everyone listening. If you take all these factors, the historical, the strategic, the cultural, the narrative elements, what are the long-term implications? Not just for the Middle East, obviously, but maybe for how we understand the way faith, power, and stories interact everywhere in international relations.
Yeah, and maybe pushing it further, are there other long-standing alliances out there, other relationships between countries that might look different if we applied this kind of multi-layered analysis, digging into their own mix of history, strategy, and culture?
Definitely something to think about, a lot to unpack.